The blood pressure cuff was too tight, digging into my arm in that specific way that makes you irrationally annoyed at a medical device, and I remember thinking that was going to be the worst part of my morning. That's genuinely the level of stakes I walked in with. I was not expecting anything else to happen that day besides mild discomfort and a lecture about my cholesterol. I hadn't been to a doctor in almost 4 years, which I know isn't something to be proud of, but life gets away from you. And then one day you're 34 and your friend Priya corners you at brunch and says she's not letting this go until you actually book an appointment. And she'd apparently already looked up a clinic near my apartment and sent me the number, so there wasn't much room to keep avoiding it. My regular doctor, a calm, no-nonsense woman named Dr. Reyes, went through the usual questions, the usual pokes and listens, and about halfway through listening to my heart, she went quiet in this particular way doctors go quiet, this focused, unreadable pause, and moved the stethoscope to a slightly different spot and listened again. I said, "Is there something wrong?" trying to keep my voice light and failing a little. She said, "Probably nothing. I'm hearing a small irregularity, nothing that should alarm you today, but I want a specialist to take a proper look rather than guessing based on what I'm hearing with this thing." She tapped the stethoscope against her palm like it was the instrument's fault for being ambiguous. "There's a cardiologist who just joined a practice 2 floors up with a good reputation taking new patients. I can send a referral over today if you want to get it looked at soon rather than sitting with it." I said sure, mostly on autopilot, the way you agree to things at a doctor's office, because arguing with medical caution feels like arguing with gravity. She typed something into her computer, said the referral would go through by the end of day, and that was that. I left with a printed after-visit summary I didn't really read and went back to my normal week, only mildly rattled, filing the whole thing under things to deal with later. I want to back up for a second though, because none of what happened next makes sense without understanding a piece of my life from 12 years earlier, a piece I hadn't thought about in any real detail in a long time, though it turns out I'd never actually stopped carrying it, I'd just gotten good at not looking directly at it. In college I had a roommate named Elias. We were paired randomly freshman year, the way you are, two names on a housing list that some administrative algorithm decided should share 200 square feet, and it could have gone badly, roommate pairings often do, but it didn't. It went the opposite of badly. We were inseparable within about 3 weeks, staying up too late talking about nothing, developing the specific shorthand you only get with someone who's around you enough to learn all your patterns. He was pre-med even then, serious about it in a way that felt almost intimidating, but never in a way that made him insufferable, just focused, like he already knew exactly what he wanted his life to look like. There are small things I remember with a clarity that surprises me now, given how much time has passed. He drank his coffee black and pretended not to hate it, because he thought ordering anything with milk in it made him look less serious to the older residents on our floor, and I used to tease him mercilessly about it, and he'd take the teasing with this half-annoyed, half-delighted expression that I found, even then, more charming than I let myself admit. He kept a running list on a whiteboard of every terrible pun I made, dated like evidence he intended to use against me someday. I still don't know what he was planning to do with that evidence. I never asked. I don't think I let myself examine what I felt about him too closely at the time. I told myself it was just a really good friendship, the kind you get lucky with maybe once in your life, and mostly I still believe that was partially true. But there was an undercurrent to it, something neither of us named, small moments that added up over 3 years, him falling asleep against my shoulder during a movie and neither of us moving to fix it, a specific way he'd look at me sometimes when he thought I wasn't paying attention that I noticed anyway. Once, sophomore year, a mutual friend asked, half joking at a party, whether we were secretly together, and neither of us laughed it off as fast as two just friends probably should have. We caught each other's eye across the room afterward, and neither of us said anything about it, which in hindsight said quite a lot on its own. The closest we ever came to nomming it happened the night before he left for a summer research fellowship that ended up being the actual turning point of his whole career, the thing that got him into the medical school he wanted, 3 states away. We were sitting on the roof of our dorm, which technically we weren't supposed to have access to but had figured out a way onto anyway. This narrow ledge behind a maintenance door that stuck if you didn't know the trick to it, and it was late, and neither of us was talking much, and at some point he turned to me and said, "Quiet, I don't really want to go tomorrow," and I said, "Why not?" and he said, "You know why not," and looked at me in this way that made my whole chest go still. I don't know exactly what would have happened next. I've wondered about it more times than I'd like to admit. Because right at that moment, his phone rang and it was his mother, and I could tell from his face before he even answered that something was wrong, and it turned out his grandmother had taken a bad fall that night, and they needed him to change his flight to leave first thing in the morning instead of that afternoon as planned, which meant instead of one more day together, we had about 4 rushed hours of him packing while I sat on his bed trying to be useful, and mostly just watching him leave in pieces. We hugged goodbye at 5 in the morning, both of us wrecked with exhaustion and something unspoken, and he said, "I'll call you," and I said, "I know," and for about a year he did. Then the calls got further apart, the way they do when two people's lives start pulling in genuinely different directions. Med school swallowing his time whole, me building a life on the opposite coast, and eventually the calls stopped altogether without either of us deciding that on purpose. The way most friendships from that era of your life just quietly end without a final conversation. Just a slow fade neither person chooses exactly, but neither person fights either. I hadn't heard his name in probably 8 years, which is important because it's part of why what happened next caught me so completely off guard. The cardiology appointment was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I showed up 15 minutes early because that's what the intake form told me to do, filled out the usual stack of paperwork in the waiting room, family history, current medications, all of it, and I noticed the name on the office door on my way in, a small engraved plaque that said Dr. E. Marsh Whitfield, which meant absolutely nothing to me at the time. Elias' last name in college had just been Marsh. I didn't put anything together. Why would I have? People get married, names get hyphenated, and a common enough first initial paired with an unfamiliar second surname doesn't exactly light up any alarm bells. I sat in the exam room for what felt like a long time, the particular kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of your own heartbeat, which is a genuinely unhelpful thing to be hyper-aware of in a cardiologist's office. Then there was a knock and the door opened, and the person walking in with a tablet under his arm was Elias. I want to try to describe what that actually felt like because it wasn't like the movies. It wasn't some slow-motion moment of romantic recognition. It was confusion at first, this jarring, almost dizzying half-second where my brain was trying to reconcile a face from 12 years ago with the specific wrong context of a cardiology exam room, before the confusion cracked open into something closer to shock. He stopped dead in the doorway. The tablet actually slipped slightly in his grip before he caught it. He said my name like a question, like he needed to hear himself say it to believe it, and I said his. And for a solid few seconds neither of us said anything else, just stood there, or in my case sat there on the exam table in a paper gown feeling deeply unprepared for this particular reunion. He started, then stopped, then tried again. Your chart said your last name, but it's common enough, and the birthday didn't click until I actually opened the door, and then it was just, I mean, obviously it's you. I don't know why I'm explaining this like there's a logical version of this moment. I said something equally incoherent back, some half-sentence about how I hadn't even registered his name on the door because it wasn't the one I remembered, and he said, "Right, the hyphenate, that's a whole separate conversation actually," in a tone that told me there was a story there I wasn't going to get in this particular room. He recovered first, in that practiced professional way I imagine you have to learn in medical training, and said, "I need to just give me 1 second," and stepped back out into the hallway, and I heard him say something quiet to a nurse. And when he came back in a minute later he'd visibly reassembled himself into doctor mode, though his hands, I noticed, weren't quite as steady as they'd probably normally be, and he fumbled the cap off his pen twice before actually clicking it. He said, "I have to ask you this professionally, even though it feels insane given the circumstances. Is it all right if I'm the one who examines you today, or would you rather I have a colleague take over? I want you to feel completely comfortable either way, and there's no wrong answer." I said it was fine, mostly because in the moment I genuinely couldn't imagine explaining the situation to a colleague more than I could imagine sitting through the actual appointment. And he nodded, and we got through it, him asking the standard questions in a voice that kept almost slipping out of clinical and into something more familiar before catching itself. Me answering on some kind of autopilot, while my brain was doing several other things at once entirely unrelated to my heart's electrical patterns. The actual diagnosis, when it came, was almost anticlimactic compared to everything else happening in that room. He listened for a long while, checked the readout from an EKG a nurse had run earlier, and said, "It looks like a fairly mild case of what we call PVCs, extra heartbeats that throw off the rhythm slightly. Very common, usually not dangerous on their own, though we'll want to keep an eye on frequency and make sure there's nothing else going on underneath it. Caffeine, stress, and sleep can all make it worse. I'd like to see you again in 6 weeks to check in." I said, "So I'm not dying," half joking, mostly not, and he looked up at me. And for just a second the doctor mask slipped entirely and it was just Elias looking at me, something raw and complicated on his face, and he said quietly, "No, you're not dying. But I think I need about 5 minutes with you that has nothing to do with your heart rhythm if you're willing after I finish up my morning." He found me in the parking lot almost 2 hours later, coat still on over his scrubs, looking like a man who'd been rehearsing what to say the entire time and had thrown most of it out anyway. He said, "I've thought about you more times over the last 12 years than is probably healthy to admit to someone in a parking lot. I tried reaching out twice actually. Once about 6 years ago, I got as far as finding an old email address that bounced. Once about 3 years ago, right after a relationship ended that probably should have ended a lot sooner than it did, and I chickened out before I even finished typing the message. And then this morning I opened a chart with your name on it and your date of birth, and I had to stand in a hallway for a full minute just to remember how to breathe like a professional. I asked him what he'd been planning to say, in the message he never finished 3 years ago, and he laughed this short, embarrassed sound and said, "Something unbearably dramatic, probably." I don't actually remember the exact words. I remember deleting it about 4 times before giving up completely. I think I was scared you'd either not remember me at all, which somehow felt worse than the alternative, or that you'd remember exactly how things ended and have every reason to ignore it. I told him I'd wondered about him too, more than I usually let myself admit, that I'd looked him up exactly once years ago, late one night, and found nothing current enough to make sense of, and eventually stopped looking because it felt like picking at something that wasn't going to heal faster for the attention. He said, "I need to be upfront about something because I think you deserve that more than you deserve me being smooth about this. I can't be your doctor and also be whatever this is trying to become. That's not me being dramatic, it's an actual ethical line I'm not willing to cross, even for this. So if there's any part of you that wants to find out what this could be, I need to transfer your care to my colleague down the hall, effective today, and I need you to actually agree to have coffee with me sometime this week. Because if I let you walk to your car right now without asking, I don't trust myself to work up the nerve twice in one lifetime." I said yes to the coffee before I'd even fully processed the rest of the sentence. I want to tell you the next part wasn't complicated, but that would be a lie because 12 years is a long time and neither of us was the same person who'd sat on that roof at 19. There was a real conversation over that first coffee about the phone calls that had faded, about whether either of us had done anything wrong by letting it happen. And we mostly landed on no, not really. That's just what happens to a lot of good things when circumstance gets in the way and nobody fights hard enough against the current to keep it afloat. He told me about the relationship that had ended 3 years back, a fiancé actually, someone he'd been with for 4 years before realizing neither of them was fully present for the other. And he said something that stuck with me, that ending that engagement had been the first time in a decade he'd let himself ask what he actually wanted instead of what looked correct on paper. I told Priya about all of it that same week, mostly because I needed someone to tell me I wasn't losing my mind, and she had a more complicated reaction than I expected. She'd known me during the tail end of the Elias years, had watched me go quiet for a while after the calls stopped coming, and she said carefully, "I want to be happy for you and part of me is genuinely. But I also remember how long it took you to stop checking your phone every time it buzzed back when you were still hoping it might be him. I just don't want you handing him the same hope again without him actually earning it back first." I told her that was fair and I meant it, and I carried that caution with me into the next few weeks more than I let on to Elias directly. It showed up one night over dinner about 2 weeks after the parking lot conversation, when he reached for my hand across the table and I pulled it back, not dramatically, just enough that he noticed, and he asked what was wrong and I told him the truth. I said, "I need you to understand that the version of me sitting across from you now spent a long time afraid to want things too openly. Because the last time I let myself want something this specific, it just quietly stopped without an ending, and I never got to ask why, and some part of me needs to know this isn't going to happen the same way twice before I let myself fully lean into it." He was quiet for a moment, turning his water glass slowly on the table, and then he said, "That's fair, and I think you deserve an actual answer instead of just an apology." The call stopped because residency ate every spare hour I had for almost 3 years straight, and I told myself you deserved better than the scraps of attention I had left to give, so I let it go instead of giving you something I thought was insufficient. I know now that was the wrong call. I should have sent the scraps. I should have let you decide whether they were enough instead of deciding for you. He looked up at me. "I'm not in residency anymore. I have actual time now and I intend to use it properly this time if you'll let me." That did more for me than I expected a single explanation to do. I reached back across the table and took his hand myself this time, and neither of us said anything else about it for the rest of that dinner, but something in my chest settled that hadn't settled in a very long time. There was a moment, about 3 weeks into us actually seeing each other properly, dinners and long walks and the specific nervous energy of starting something with history already built into it, where Elias reached into his coat pocket during a walk and pulled out something small and worn at the edges. It was a photo strip, the kind you get from an old-fashioned photo booth, 4 little black and white frames of the two of us from sophomore year making faces, laughing in the last one at something neither of us could probably even remember now. He said, "I kept this in every wallet I've owned since college. I told myself for years it was just a nice memory. I think I always knew it was more than that." I didn't have anything as tangible to hand back to him, but I told him the truth, that I still remembered the exact tone of his voice saying I don't really want to go tomorrow, that I'd carried that sentence around for 12 years without ever fully setting it down, and that some stubborn, quiet part of me had never quite believed the story between us was actually finished, even when every practical sign said it was. I found out about the hyphenate a few weeks later, almost by accident, when he mentioned it while we were doing dishes at his apartment. Of all mundane moments to get an answer I'd been quietly curious about since the exam room. He said his mother had remarried when he was in his second year of medical school, to a man named Whitfield who'd become, in Elias' words, the first father figure who ever actually showed up, and Elias had added the name professionally afterward as a quiet thank you his stepfather never asked for and almost cried about anyway when he found out. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a secret he'd been guarding. It was just a small, tender fact about his life from the years I'd missed, one of what I imagined would be hundreds still waiting to surface between us, little pieces of a decade we hadn't lived through together. It's been 8 months since that appointment. My PVCs, for the record, have calmed down considerably, which my new cardiologist, a perfectly nice man named Dr. Okonkwo who has no idea he's dadding advice adjacent to my medical chart, says is probably a combination of better sleep and less stress, though he doesn't know the specific source of either improvement. Elias still keeps that photo strip in his wallet. I checked once not that long ago, half joking that he should probably retire for something more current, and he just looked at me and said, "Why would I retire the thing that reminds me love doesn't always disappear just because life gets in the way of it for a while. Sometimes it just waits." Badly, impatiently at the bottom of a wallet for 12 years, but it waits. Priya comes around too mostly. She still gives Elias a look sometimes that I think is permanent at this point, some older sister instinct that isn't going anywhere no matter how well things go. But she was there at his birthday dinner last month, and I caught her laughing at one of his terrible puns, the same kind he used to keep a running tally of on a dorm whiteboard 12 years ago, and I decided that counted as approval, even if she'd never say it outright. I think about that tight blood pressure cuff sometimes, how sure I was that morning that discomfort was the worst thing waiting for me. I think about how close this whole story came to not happening at all if Priya hadn't nagged me into that first appointment, if Dr. Ray's hadn't happened to catch something faint enough that a less careful doctor might have missed it, if Elias had married that fiancée 3 years earlier and never opened my chart with the specific, unrepeatable timing that he did. None of it was engineered. None of it was fate in any grand, cosmic sense I actually believe in. It was just an ordinary Tuesday morning that happened to crack open into something extraordinary, the way ordinary mornings occasionally do if you're paying close enough attention when it happens. If you're sitting on something you never said to someone, some sentence you left unfinished because life interrupted at exactly the wrong moment, I don't have a tidy piece of advice for you, because I know it doesn't always work out the way it worked out for me. But I will say this, 12 years is a long time to wonder about 4 unfinished hours on a dorm rooftop. And sometimes the story isn't actually over just because the two of you stopped talking about it out loud.